Hi there, this is the third episode in our four-part journey through the 9 realms of Norse mythology. Let's go! Let's continue with the final group, the side quest ones. These realms aren't often in the spotlight, so to understand them, we have to step into speculative territory. Starting with Vanaheim, arguably the most disputed of the three. Let's start with the basics. Vanaheim is the home of the gods' tribe known as the Vanir. Unlike the Aesir, who were strongly associated with war, honor, and the establishment of law, the Vanir were more attuned to magic and were linked to nature, fertility, and prophetic gifts, known as cider. Although their realm is never described in the classical sources, scholars have speculated that it would be a land filled with vibrant forests, fruitful fields, and vast plains. This assumption arises both from the Vanir's association with fertility rituals and from the suffix in the name itself. The ending, heim rather than gard, suggests a more natural world, one aligned with the concept of Utgard, and thus distant from the internal order found in Midgard and Asgard. However, more recent studies suggest that this description is an inherently modern reconstruction, and that Snorri's Prose Edda significantly expanded the division between the Aesir and the Vanir without there necessarily being a cultural foundation to support such an approach. Today, 3 main perspectives are commonly explored when discussing the Vanir and their domain. The Vanir as pre-Indo-European deities. The Vanir are seen as a group of gods originating from agrarian societies that predated a possible Indo-European migration. Over time, the Indo-European peoples would have supplanted the Vanir cult with their own warlike gods, the Aesir. The Vanir-Aesir War would be a reminder of that occurrence. The Vanir as fertility gods within the Norse pantheon. In this interpretation, the Vanir are not from a separate cultural origin, but rather fulfill the third function, fertility, as outlined in Dumézil's trifunctional hypothesis. This complements the first and second functions, sovereignty, order, and warfare, embodied by the Aesir. Thus, while the Vanir are presented as a separate group, they are part of the same religious system. The Vanir and Aesir as interchangeable terms for gods. According to this view, there was never any real division between Vanir and Aesir. They were not distinct groups at all. The separation would have emerged from a speculative and ultimately mistaken interpretation introduced in the Prose Edda by Snorri himself. Considering that I'm not particularly fond of the third hypothesis, especially since the Poetic Edda itself seems to contradict it, I tend to favor the first 2 interpretations. In both Vafthrudnismal and Lokasenna, we're told that Njordr, the most well-known of the Vanir gods, was raised in Vanaheim and later sent to the Aesir as a hostage. And once among them, Loki mocks him, calling him an incestuous hostage of the Aesir, a line that clearly places Njordr as an outsider from the group Loki sees himself as part of. That doesn't really line up with the idea that Vanir and Aesir were always the same. So, from a practical standpoint, I tend to focus on the first 2 hypotheses, which lead to very different implications for Vanaheim. If the second hypothesis is correct, Vanir as fertility gods within the same pantheon, then Vanaheim may have been nothing more than a domain within Asgard, just like Bilskirnir, Breidablik, Folkvanger, and other well-attested halls or regions in the gods' realm. This would also include Alfheim. Spoiler alert, we'll get to that soon. But if the first hypothesis is right, Vanir as pre-Indo-European deities later absorbed by the Aesir, then Vanaheim is a truly separate realm, a remnant of a different religious tradition, partially merged into Norse cosmology. It would have stood apart from Asgard, perhaps in the east, as Loki implies in Lokasenna near Niflheim. That might also help explain why only 3 deities, Njordr, Freyr, Freya, are ever explicitly identified as Vanir in all historical sources. Personally, I favor the first hypothesis, not only for its historical plausibility, but also because it provides a compelling mythological metaphor, a pantheon forged from the union of opposites, the wild and the ordered, the fertile and the warlike. But naturally, due to the lack of source material, all 3 interpretations remain valid. This video is the third in a 4-part series on the 9 realms. In this episode, we'll explore the third group, the side quest realms. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next parts. In the video description, you'll find complimentary information about the series, including some of the most important books used as references, as well as a link to our website, where a full essay on the topic is available for purchase. Now, on to the video. Let's move on to Alfheim. The realm of the Elves is mentioned only briefly in the surviving sources and never described in detail. No landscapes, no cities, no halls. The familiar image of it as an eternal springtime paradise is a modern invention, based solely on the Elves' association with beauty and fertility. The primary reference comes from Grimnismal in the Poetic Edda, where we are told that Alfheim was given to Freyr as a tooth gift, a traditional present given to a child upon cutting their first tooth. In the same sequence, Odin enumerates the dwellings of various gods, Alfheim among them, which has led some to wonder whether it was truly regarded as a separate world, or simply part of Asgard, like Gladsheimer, Thrudheimer, Breidablik, and others in the same list. The name itself means elf home, which naturally leads to the question, who exactly were the elves? In Germanic mythology, elves are spiritual beings who dwell in the space between gods and humans, neither fully divine nor entirely mortal. Far from the tall, ethereal warriors of modern fantasy, their role was more complex and quite different from the version popularized by Tolkien's works. They could be revered as bringers of prosperity, or feared as bringers of illness and misfortune. Associated with fertility and magic, they were closely bound to the natural world. Yet, despite these similarities with the Vanir, it is the Aesir who appear most often alongside elves in the Eddas. Even then, the elves remain background figures, never taking a central role, and the limited evidence leaves much about them uncertain. In the prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson calls them light elves, dwellers of Ljósalfheimr, and contrasts them with the dark elves of Svartalfheim, the former associated with radiance and benevolence, the latter with shadow and chaos. Despite this distinction, most scholars agree that Alfheim and Ljósalfheimr refer to the same place. The dark elves, meanwhile, are often equated with dwarves, a topic we will return to later. Snorri's portrayal is debated. Some scholars see it as a deliberate, perhaps exaggerated, attempt to align elves with the imagery of Catholic angels, an approach that distances them from their earlier Germanic roots. In pre-Christian tradition, elves could be revered, but they could also be feared, blamed for sickness, misfortune, or curses. Despite the confusion over names, the term Alfheim remains more common in academic writing, partly because its linguistic footprint stretches beyond Norse tradition. In Scottish ballads, for example, elves are said to dwell in Elfheim, a name that appears to share the same root as Alfheim, hinting at a deeper, older connection within the broader Germanic world. In the end, Alfheim's place among the Nine Realms may owe less to its role in the surviving Norse myths, and more to the lasting cultural significance of the elves themselves, beings who, even in their mystery, have never fully faded from the imagination. Now, let's go down to Svartalfheim. If Alfheim suffers from a scarcity of description, Svartalfheim suffers from a confusion of identity. Its very name, home of the dark elves, immediately raises the question, where these creatures appear in other sources. They may well be one of the most singular ideas found in Snorri's prose Edda. Yet, looking closely at his descriptions, it becomes clear why many scholars consider these dark elves to be nothing more than dwarves under another name. Even so, I still find the name Svartalfheim more appealing than Nidavellir, and I'll explain why in a moment. Before that, let's talk about Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda invention. The Svartalfar live underground, harness the hidden powers of the earth, and forge the greatest treasures of the gods. For example, in Gylfaginning, Skirnir travels to Svartalfheim to have the Svartalfar craft the magical fetter Gleipnir to bind Fenrir. Functionally, this is not so different from the episode in the Poetic Edda, where Sigurd asks Regin, the dwarf, to reforge his broken magical sword, Gram. If we accept Svartalfheim as the realm of the dwarves, its character emerges naturally. a dark subterranean world lit by forges and the glow of molten metal. An industrial labyrinth of workshops, tunnels, and stone halls. But there is a limit to how much of the popular image of the dwarves' home can be drawn from the Eddas themselves. The familiar portrait of dwarves as short and bearded does not come from the Old Norse sources at all. It stems from later tradition, such as the Nibelungenlied. In that German epic, the previously mentioned Sigurd appears as Siegfried, and the dwarves play a much more prominent role than they do in the Eddas, absorbing traits once associated with trolls. This lack of description in the older sources is also evident in the Poetic Edda's counterpart, Nidavellir, a place explicitly named as the dwarves' home only once, in Voluspa, as the dark fields where Sindri's kin dwell in a hall of gold. The poem offers no further detail, no hint of its landscape, location, or relationship to the other realms, beyond a vague mention of it being in the north. Its preference over Svartalfheim in some modern reconstructions of Norse cosmology owes more to Snorri's prose dismissal than to any major relevance in the older tradition, the opposite of what happened with Alfheim. In that sense, Svartalfheim, by a winding path, echoes a much older tradition in which elves and dwarves were not sharply distinct from each other. It is speculative, but highly plausible, that both Alfar and Vergar, elves and dwarves, descend from Indo-European mythological figures associated with nature, fertility, the dead, disease, affliction, and magical powers. The oldest references do not clearly separate them into different species. Instead, they seem to belong to a shared category of liminal beings, humanoid spirits possessing great magical power. Over time, as societies grew more complex, their roles diverged. Beings associated with tools, weapons, and enchanted objects became specialized craft spirits, while those linked to wilderness, fertility, dreams, or sickness remained bound to untamed natural forces. This thematic and functional split reflects deep symbolic archetypes visible across many mythologies. In Greek tradition, for instance, the nymphs embody fertility, chaos, and the uncanny, while the Telchines act as transformative mediators, shaping nature into culture through fire and tools. It is, therefore, not an exclusive characteristic of Norse mythology. In the end, these three, Vanaheim, Alfheim, and Svartalfheim, sit on the fringes of Norse cosmology. They're not the great stages where Ragnarok plays out, or where the gods fight their most famous battles. They're the quieter corners of the Nine Realms, places hinted at, named in passing, or refracted through later retellings. And yet, it's often in these margins that echoes of forgotten cultures, overlapping identities, and the slow blending of traditions survive. If the main campaign realms are the spine of the Norse mythic world, then the side quest ones are its hidden pathways. That's all for now. If you enjoyed this dive into the Nine Realms, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss our next journey. See you in the next video. Bye.